When my son-in-law slapped my daughter in front of 200 guests, I didn't scream or cry. I just smiled because I already knew exactly how to destroy him. Those words still echo in my head like a drumbeat I can't escape. The sound of that slap, the gasp of the crowd, the music cutting off mid-note, it all happened in a single, blinding second. One moment, my daughter, Leela, was radiant, glowing in her white gown, the happiest I'd ever seen her. The next, her face twisted in shock and pain, her cheek red with the mark of his hand. And standing across from her, that man, her brand new husband, Michael, with fury still burning in his eyes, as if she had done something wrong. People froze. You could hear the forks clinking back onto plates, whispers starting to ripple through the hall like a wave of shame no one wanted to surf. But me? I didn't move. I didn't run to her. I didn't confront him. I just stood there, staring, calm on the outside, while my insides were unraveling in fire. Because deep down, I knew this day was coming. Maybe not like this, but something inside me had been warning me for months. See, when Leela first brought Michael home, he was all charm, the kind of man who looked everyone in the eye, laughed a little too loud, and said all the right things. But as a mother, you know. You know. There's a certain tightness in a smile, a flicker in the gaze, the way he'd always need to dominate a conversation, correct her when she spoke, interrupt her little jokes. I saw it all. I even pulled Leela aside once and said, "Sweetheart, are you sure he treats you right when no one's looking?" She brushed it off, said he was just stressed from work, that he could be intense, but he loved her. And I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her so badly. Because after everything she'd been through, losing her father young, putting herself through college, trying to build a life, she deserved happiness. I couldn't bear to be the one to shatter it. But Michael, he had a temper. I saw the first time when he yelled at a waiter during dinner. The poor man brought him sparkling water instead of still, and Michael made such a scene that people around us started staring. Leela looked mortified. I caught her hand under the table, squeezed it, and whispered, "This isn't normal." But she just whispered back, "He's just stressed from work, that he can be intense, but he loves her." That's when I knew I'd have to watch quietly, for her sake. Because when you tell a woman in love that her man's not good for her, she'll defend him harder than herself. Fast forward to the wedding day. Everything was perfect. Or so it seemed. The flowers, the lights, the laughter. I remember standing near the edge of the dance floor, watching them take their first dance. Her head was on his shoulder, her smile was soft, and for a brief, fragile moment, I thought maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe this was her miracle after all. But then something happened. Something small. Something only a mother's eyes would catch. She said something, maybe teased him, and he stiffened. His smile dropped. The dance slowed. His grip on her arm tightened just enough to make her flinch. I saw her try to laugh it off. And then he said something into her ear that made her expression falter. I'll never know what it was, but I could feel the air shift. Minutes later, during the toast, it happened. Leela made a playful comment, something about how Michael took longer than her to get ready that morning, and people laughed. He didn't. He turned toward her, face rigid, eyes sharp, and before anyone could intervene, he slapped her. Hard. Right there, at the head table, in front of everyone who loved her. The sound cracked louder than the microphone feedback. My daughter's hand went to her cheek. I'll never forget the look in her eyes, not just pain, but disbelief. The kind of heartbreak that doesn't come from one slap, but from realizing the person you love just exposed who they truly are. And me? I felt the world go still. My heart pounded so loud, it drowned out the gasps around us. But I didn't move. I didn't scream. I didn't even blink. Because in that stillness, something inside me hardened. I'd seen enough of men like him, controlling, cruel, using love as a leash. I spent my own youth trapped with one. My late husband, Leela's father, had his own darkness too. He never raised his hand in public, but behind closed doors his words were blades. The insults, the manipulation, the constant need to make me feel small. It took me years to find my way out. And I swore to myself that my daughter would never live the same way. So as I watched Michael's hand fall back to his side, as I saw the shame burning across Leela's face, I made a silent promise. He would regret the day he ever thought he could humiliate her. I didn't know how exactly, not yet, but I knew one thing. Revenge is best served when everyone's watching. So, I smiled. Yes, I actually smiled. People probably thought I'd lost my mind, but it wasn't madness. It was control. I walked over slowly. Every step deliberate, heels clicking on the marble floor like gunshots in the silence. Michael tried to speak, stammer something about a misunderstanding, but I held up a hand. "You've done enough," I said quietly. He looked confused, maybe even relieved, thinking I was trying to de-escalate. Oh, poor fool. I took my daughter's hand, her trembling, tear-streaked hand, and I looked her in the eyes. "Go to the dressing room," I whispered, just loud enough for her to hear. "Fix your makeup. Don't you dare cry for him in front of them." She hesitated, then nodded and left, holding her chin high. That's my girl. Then I turned back to Michael. The guests were whispering, phones out, eyes darting between us. Some of his groomsmen tried to step in, but I stopped them with a single glance. "Sit," I told them, and they did. Then I looked at the crowd, our family, friends, everyone who mattered, and I said, "I think we should all give a round of applause to the groom for showing us his true face so early." The silence was suffocating. Then someone in the back clapped. Another followed. A few nervous chuckles broke the tension. Michael's face turned pale, then red. He tried to speak, but I leaned in and said softly, "You'll speak when I'm done." What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd already been prepared for this. I'd seen the signs, and I had something he didn't. Evidence. Months ago, when I first suspected he might be mistreating her, I started quietly collecting things. Texts, voicemails, photos. Leela never knew, but I'd been protecting her from the shadows. That slap had just given me permission to use it. What would you have done in my place? Would you have called the police right there? Would you have dragged him out by the collar? Or would you have done what I did? Smiled, waited, and let him think he was still in control. Because trust me, sometimes the most satisfying revenge doesn't start with screaming. It starts with silence. And that night, I decided this wedding wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I watched him through the glass doors of the bridal suite while Leela fixed her lipstick and forced a laugh into the mirror. Her hands were still trembling. Every time she thought about going back out there, her smile snapped like a brittle twig. She wanted to salvage the evening. "It was a mistake, Mom. He'll apologize," she said. And I heard the woman who had spent her life stitching hope onto impossible things. But I knew how apologies from men like him worked. Loud, hollow, crafted to look like remorse, but meant only to soothe the witnesses, not to change the behavior. My promise to her had nothing to do with spectacle. It had everything to do with removing him from her life permanently, with a kind of surgical precision that would leave no room for him to slither back in. So I put on my coat, not because I was leaving the venue, God, no, but because I needed to move. I had to get to work while everyone else was still dazzled by cake and champagne.
Revenge, I've learned, isn't a single roar. It's a series of small, precise strikes. Each must land where it will do the most damage. I'd been collecting these strikes quietly for months. His late-night messages when he thought no one could read them, a voicemail where he mocked Leela's expense account, a picture of him with a woman he'd sworn was just a colleague. Little things that painted a picture of a man who liked to own people and then discard them when they weren't amusing him anymore. Evidence, in other words, proof that could turn whispers into legal weight and gossip into a courtroom of public opinion. First step? Isolate him. If I let him stew among his groomsmen and brothers-in-law, he would find allies or at least people willing to smooth it over. I needed his support network brittle and small. I called my sister under the pretense of, "We need to check on Leela," then slipped out to find Michael's best man. He was at the bar, awkwardly reciting a speech he hadn't prepared for, his tie askew. I smiled like a worried mother and said in a low voice, "Henry, I need you to do something for me. Just keep an eye on him." Henry blinked, confused. "Keep an eye on him how?" he asked. "So he doesn't do anything else stupid," I said. And because Henry liked being helpful, and because I had sown my smile with the kind of trust people handed me, he agreed. Little by little, I seeded the idea that Michael was unraveling. The more hands I put between him and the room, the more he would feel cornered, and cornered men do reckless things. Next, control the narrative. The first thing abusers rely on after a public incident is distortion. They spin a story where they are the wronged party. I knew this instinctively. It had been used on me before. So I needed to make sure the story circulating was not his version. I pulled aside a close friend of Leela's who'd always been sharp with words and asked her to get up and give an impromptu toast. "Praise the bride," I whispered. "Praise her strength." I lined up 3 people I trusted, Leela's college roommate, her boss, and my neighbor. Each had seen Michael's bad side in subtle, enforceable ways. If they spoke honestly, the fracture would widen. I watched as they agreed, discreet and fierce. These weren't the grand moves. They were the scaffolding that would let the rest of the house of cards fall. There were obstacles, of course. Michael's father had money and manners, and a temper that matched his son's. He hovered like a shadow, and every time I tried to corner Michael, the elder would step in with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes and smooth everything. Once, when I attempted to show Henry a damning text on my phone, Michael's father drifted too close and asked to see the message as if he was merely curious. I closed the screen and smiled, deflecting with a joke about how mobile reception betrayed me. He chuckled and walked away. It was a small thing, but it showed me I couldn't be obvious. I would have to move invisibly.
So I escalated in smaller, cunning ways. I requested the venue manager to place the wedding video's raw footage on a delay. I told him, truthfully, that the bride had asked for privacy for a moment. He obliged, thinking it was a harmless favor for a mother. That footage, I knew, would capture more than guests' surprised faces. It would catch the seconds before and after the slap. And sometimes, the split-second reactions tell a different story than the whole. I used the pretense of fixing her makeup later to get Leela to the suite, where I quietly booted on my laptop and started compiling everything I'd collected. Texts, voicemails, photo timestamps, the footage the manager had tucked away. Each brick was a wall. Each brick made the wall I was building feel more inevitable. But here's the part of revenge that almost everyone forgets. Your target fights back. Michael began to sense the trap. He became less theatrical and more dangerous, the kind of quiet that precedes a storm. He started whispering in Leela's ear again, apologies laden with strings, trying to rebuild the small scaffolding of charm that had once bound her. He made eyes at his groomsmen, looking for validation, and his smile became a mask that didn't fit. At one point, he cornered me in the corridor,
And for a horrible second, I thought he might try something else. He stepped toward me and hissed, "You don't get to ruin my night." I met his eyes and said calmly, "I don't plan to ruin a night. I plan to end a life's humiliation." He laughed, disgusted, and walked away. But the laugh had no warmth. He knew I had teeth. That night, he would test them. I also had to manage Leela's consent and agency. Revenge without her trust would be theft. She sat on the edge of the bed, fingers entwined, and said, "Do whatever you have to, Mom, but don't humiliate him for my sake." She was trying to protect him in her way. Love makes people generous in the wrong direction. I put my hands on her shoulders and told her the truth. "I'll never do anything that will hurt you. I'll only pull him out into the light so you can choose what to do with him." She closed her eyes and, for the first time that night, let herself cry openly. Those were the tears I'd been trying to prevent, not for shame, but for release. Now for the set piece. I needed an arena where truth could not be smothered by money or charm. Social media is that arena these days. Quick, public, unforgiving. I asked Leela's brother to help me upload a candid, raw video clip to a private family group first. The smack, the stunned faces, and the audio of Michael's snide remark right before he struck. I wanted the family to feel the moment as it had happened, unedited and ugly. So when Michael's camp tried to spin, they'd be fighting a war everyone had already seen. We posted it quietly, then arranged for a trusted friend to leak it to a local acquaintance who ran a popular community page. Within the hour, the clip would be floating on feeds, unspooling through the town, because I wanted the town to know. I wanted him to feel the weight of being watched. There were near misses. Twice, the clip almost got taken down by well-timed legal threats. Once, Michael texted me directly, not an apology, but a threat veiled in courtesy. "You'll regret this," he wrote. I forwarded it to Leela's phone and to my attorney friend, who laughed and said, "This is the kind of thing that makes courts care." The threats, the attempts at extinguishing the flame, only added oxygen. People hate bullies until they see a bully get scared. Once that weakness shows, even their allies shift. By midnight, the reception had thinned. Some guests had left in discomfort, some stayed in awkward loyalty, and a group had congregated around the dance floor, as if drawn by a simmering magnet. The footage was out there, the people who mattered had seen it, and Michael's world had the tremor of a man watching a building crack around him. I sat with Leela in the suite, holding her hand, and we made a plan for the next morning. A quiet call to the police with timestamps and a lawyer on standby, a scheduled meeting with the venue manager to secure the video files, and a list of witnesses who would back up what they seen. The plan had to be ironclad. Do you know what the strangest part of being the person who pulls the strings is? It's the quiet satisfaction that isn't loud or vindictive, but steady, like wind shaping rock. Each step I took wasn't about revenge for revenge's sake. It was about protecting my daughter from a life that would eat her alive in small, invisible ways. It was about punishing the pattern, not only the act. There were moments I wanted to rip his face off then and there, to scream and to strike, but I knew the slow machine would do more harm to him than a single petulant moment of violence. Patience and proof, that's the weapon. As the clock slid toward 1 a.m, I tucked Leela into a chair and kissed her forehead. "Sleep," I said. "Tomorrow we do the rest." She closed her eyes, and for the first time that night, the muscles in her jaw unclenched. The storm had begun, but we were not its victims, we were its architects. And somewhere downstairs, the man who raised his hand at my daughter was pacing, unaware that his next move would be watched by more eyes than he could imagine. I woke before dawn with the kind of calm that sits on the edge of violence. Not frantic, but ready. There's a clarity that comes after a night of outrage. The first light makes decisions feel inevitable. Leela slept like someone who'd finally let her defenses fall. The smallest rise and fall of her chest, a quiet proof that she was still just my little girl underneath the grown-up gown in the messy betrayal. I brewed coffee and put my phone on the table. The messages from last night were still there, a soft hum of outrage and sorrow and people tagging each other with the clip. The town had already done half my work. Somewhere, someone with a sense of decency had shared the footage wide enough that it hurt to look at my feed.
First order, secure the footage and the witnesses. I dressed deliberately in something that said respectable, but not soft. You learn how to wear armor in boardrooms and hospital waiting rooms. Wedding halls require a subtler kind. We drove to the venue, the reception hall quieting like a stage after the show, plastic chairs stacked and a few caterers humming in the background. The manager met us with a face that tried to hold sympathy and liability at the same time. I was polite. Politeness gets you things. "We need the raw footage," I said. "All cameras, every minute from the head table until midnight." He hesitated, but when I mentioned the attorney and the police, his shoulders went slack. Paperwork moved as if by ritual. Signatures, timestamps, someone from the security team making a copy, and in that waiting room of fluorescent lights, I felt the small, victorious thud of another brick placed in the wall. Next, we went to the police station. I'll be honest, I don't love the police. My life taught me that sometimes those who are meant to protect fold under pressure. But evidence changes things. It turns "she said" into "we saw." I handed over the files, the clip, the voicemails, the texts where he'd belittled her, the picture of him with his arm around that woman he'd called just a colleague. The officer who took our report was younger than me, which made me both sad and oddly hopeful. He listened without blinking, typed with the deliberate patience of someone who knows this is serious. "We'll open an investigation," he said, and even though I knew the legal machine moves slowly, the words felt like air in a closed room. Leela sat beside me and squeezed my hand. "Thank you," she whispered, and I felt a fierce, dizzying tenderness that made my throat tight. But the legal path is only one track. Reputation moves faster, and in some circles, faster is more final. I called Michael's workplace. There's a peculiar power in neutrality. You can't threaten a company with moralizing, so you frame truth as a risk. I spoke to HR, calmly and precisely, offering them evidence and a timeline. I did not shout. People who act out of shame scream. People who act out of purpose do not need volume. Within hours, someone from HR called back. Not a promise of action, but an acknowledgement that the files made his continued presence complicated. I watched the short clinical response like a bell ringing for the next phase. The option of him returning to a normal office life was evaporating in front of his eyes. Then came the sting I'd been saving. Do you remember when I said I'd been collecting little things? One of those little things was an old acquaintance of Michael's who'd once been involved with him, months ago, when Michael claimed fidelity and devotion. I reached out to her, with care. She was hesitant at first. People who have been used feel small when called up again. I told her simply, we have to let the truth be known so other people aren't hurt. She agreed to meet at a cafe near the courthouse, where the light spills over the tables and complicates the face you show the world. She came with a stack of screenshots, messages that painted a pattern of manipulation and dismissal. I thanked her and promised to shield her identity if she wanted it. She wanted it known. That's when I realized something crucial. People who have been wronged often feel impotent until someone hands them back their voice. Meanwhile, Michael was trying to spin. He hired a lawyer with a tailored smile and a way of making words look like armor. They sent a cease and desist to the person who'd initially posted the clip online and to a few local pages that had shared it. They threatened defamation suits and reputational ruin. It was theater, and lawyers are excellent at theatricality. But the more they shouted, the more people looked. The Streisand effect is real. You cover a stain, and everyone leans in to see what you're hiding. I forwarded the threats to the police and my attorney friend and watched the way their faces read the messages. Desperation. Men who lash out legally after being caught usually have fewer moral arguments than money ones. There were tender moments in the strategy, too. Leela hesitated when I wanted to give her the option to press charges. She worried about the smear campaign, about the whispers that would come from some corners. "What will they say about me?" she asked, eyes rimmed with the pale blue of someone who had cried herself awake. I told her the truth. They will say what cowards always say, that you move too fast, that you exaggerated, that men are fragile, and that it's easier to blame the woman. "Let them say it," I told her. "We have the footage, we have the witnesses, we have the truth. Let them talk. We'll take the heat while it's new. Then it'll fade, and you'll be free." She laughed then, a small sound, half hope, half disbelief, and it felt like wind through a cracked window, the kind that promises change. The town did what towns do. It whispered. At the bakery where I buy bread, the woman at the counter looked at me with something like apology. A neighbor crossed the street to avoid eye contact. My daughter's friends called and offered to testify, to be on the record. It was messy and human and sometimes infuriating. People are complicated. They want to support you, but fear being dragged into the storm. So I organized. I gathered written statements from those who had seen the slap. I asked the venue staff to notarize the timestamps. I scheduled depositions with the officer who'd taken our initial report. It was all tedious and boring in the way of serious work, but it felt righteous. I'd always liked paperwork in my own odd way. It clarifies chaos.
There was a moment, an hour, where I felt the plan could still snap. Michael, sensing both legal and social pressure, tried to force his way into Leela's world with a public apology that sounded rehearsed and sickly sweet. He posted a video where he blamed stress, where he said he'd made a grave mistake, and where he begged for privacy. The comments tore it apart. People called him out, with the footage threaded through every criticism. The woman in the photos sent a brief statement to a local paper. Nothing incendiary, just a confirmation that things had not been as he described. His parents issued a bland statement about family matters, as if that could smother both humiliation and evidence. I watched the video and felt a cold satisfaction, but also a warning. When men apologize, they often do it to survive, not to change. I needed to make survival for him impossible without true remorse. Then came the public meeting with his employer, a small, carefully orchestrated moment that would do more damage than an online storm. I arranged through legal channels for a member of the executive team to review the materials in confidence. They called him into a meeting and asked tough questions. I don't know what he said in that room. Shame makes people private and impenetrable. But 3 days later, there was a word that dripped through the town like a cold rain. He was put on administrative leave pending investigation. Not fired, not yet, but suspended. It's the professional equivalent of being sent to the corner to think about what you did. The suspension was a small victory, but meaningful. It meant his routine was broken, his paycheck paused, his ego bruised. For men like him, those are real consequences. The pressure had him floundering. He lashed out at social media, to friends, to anyone who would listen. But there were fissures that night I will never forget. A groomsman who used to sit with him at beer nights stopped answering his calls. His father's voice, when he did speak to him, sounded thinner somehow. People started telling me things they'd always suspected but never had the courage to say. Stories of sharp words in private, of subtle control. Each story was another nail. Do you want to know the cruel truth?
Sometimes the people we love protect the abuser because they can't imagine the man they toast at Christmas being the same man who harms. It takes proof to make those kinds of people look honest at themselves. Late one evening, when the news cycle slowed and my phone buzzed less with outrage and more with practical questions, Michael came to the house. I was alone when the knock came. He stood on my porch with a face stripped of bravado, the practiced charm replaced by something thin and raw. He said, "Please, let me explain." His voice was small. I looked at him the way you look at a snake you once liked to watch in a garden, fascinated, careful, and resolute. I let the screen door close between us and didn't invite him in. He left that night with something I think he didn't expect to feel. Fear that wasn't performative. Fear that he could be exposed, that the pattern he'd hidden behind smiles was now public and unforgiving. As the days went by, pieces of his life began to unravel in a way that felt both satisfying and sober. Revenge has a cost. It changes you. I found myself shorter with people who tried to sympathize with him, colder in ways that surprised me. There were moments I worried I had tipped too far from mother to avenger. But every time that doubt cut me, I thought of Leela at the table, the striking red of the mark on her cheek that didn't fade with lipstick or good intentions. I thought of the nights she'd learned to make herself small so others could feel big. I thought of the way she'd looked at me when she allowed herself to be vulnerable in the suite. Those images sharpened my resolve into something necessary. And then, just when I began to think the plan had settled into the legal and reputational gears I'd set, something unexpected happened. An ally I hadn't anticipated stepped forward, and with their support, the whole thing threatened to tip into something irreversible. But I won't tell you what that ally did just yet. Would you have made the same calls I made? Would you have let the law and social pressure work instead of taking him by the throat in the moment? Be honest. Would you have waited this long for payback? The ally was someone I never expected to risk everything for us. Michael's little sister, Emma. She showed up at my door 2 mornings after the suspension like a sudden gust of wind, hair a mess, eyes rimmed with fatigue, hands trembling with the weight of whatever she carried. I almost didn't open it at first. There's a part of you that distrusts gifts from inside the enemy's camp. But she was different. She didn't come with excuses. She came with a phone and a voice that broke when she said, "I'm sorry, I should have said something sooner." She told me things that, in another life, would have sounded like gossip. Michael's temper had been a quiet thing in the house. Words like steam, rising and condensing into accusations about her clothes, about how she spent money, about how she ought to be grateful. She'd kept it to herself because families keep secrets, the way some people keep heirlooms, privately, polished, and with rituals to make them feel less sharp. But the thing that made her come to me was a recording she'd found on Michael's old laptop, a voice memo he'd left to himself, the sort of private monologue abusers use to justify their own cruelty. In it, Michael laughed about teaching her a lesson, about how people needed to be put in their place. Hearing him say it out loud made Emma sick in a way that finally overrode loyalty. She asked, "What would you have done if your brother hit someone you loved? Would you have stayed quiet?" I had no answer for that. I only had a plan. We sat at my kitchen table while she handed over the phone and watched me as I listened. His voice was exactly as wrenching as she had said, calm, chilling, utterly devoid of remorse. The recording was worse than any text. It showed intent. It was the kind of proof the kind of men like him couldn't spin. I felt a new kind of cold. Not the satisfaction of victory, but the dread of the next step. Once you have that kind of rope, there's no cutting it loose without consequences. Emma agreed to testify, and in doing so, she risked family ties that would never fully heal. Her courage lit a fuse that would change everything. She also gave me access to other things, old messages, a list of men in his life who'd been quiet before, but might be persuaded to speak now that a sister had taken a stand. There's a certain power in a blood relation turning on a bully. It fractures the illusion that the abuser is loved without qualification. People who relied on family loyalty to shield him began to feel exposed themselves. With Emma's recordings in hand, the strategy changed from pressure to obliteration. I contacted the journalist I had been nurturing quietly, a woman who runs a regional column and loves a story where truth collides with hypocrisy. I fed her the timeline, the videos, the voicemails, the texts, and Emma's recording. I didn't leak everything all at once. You never set off a fuse too early. You want the explosion to be synchronized. The reporter smelled blood in the clean, judicial way journalists do. Not glee, but the sense that here was something necessary to tell. We set a date for a piece that would run the week after Michael's scheduled HR review. Timing was everything. Legal pressure, social fallout, and a public article arriving at once would leave him little room to breathe. Of course, he didn't sit still. He fought like cornered things do. His lawyer flooded my inbox with letters that read like a battering ram, threats couched in legalese, offers of private settlement, pleas for different paths. He tried to buy back allies with calls, with promises, with what I imagine passed for charm in his social circle. Once, a mutual friend called me, voice thin with loyalty, asking me to stop because the family was suffering. I told him bluntly, the family suffered long before the slap. We're doing what's necessary now. Some people were angry with me for tearing at the fabric of a family. Others told me quietly they'd been waiting for someone to do it. You can't heal people by pretending something isn't a wound.
There were close calls. A week before the article was set to run, someone tried to access the venue server where the raw footage was held. The security log showed a strange IP address and a flurry of attempted deletions. My stomach dropped when I saw it. I called the manager, who was honest and frightened. We blocked it, he said. We kept an archive offline. We moved the hard drives to a safe deposit box, and I felt the adrenaline of near-miss relief, like pulling a child away from traffic by a hair. It's a funny thing. Part of doing something public is ensuring the private foundations won't be sabotaged. Paranoia becomes a tool. Caution becomes armor. The reporter's article ran with surgical precision. It was not sensationalist trash. It was grave, meticulously sourced, and damning. It led with the footage we'd shared, threaded the recording Emma gave us, quoted witnesses, displayed messages, and closed with the company's statement that Michael was on leave pending an investigation. The piece hit the feeds like a blunt instrument. People shared it, commented, and more importantly, called HR, called the police, and called old friends who then called us with their own stories. The human echo chamber amplified the evidence into a chorus. I read the article with my hands clasped so tight my knuckles whitened. There was relief, and there was a fear that this would be where it ended, a story that burned brightly for a day and then cooled into gossip. But the legal wheels were turning now. The police had more than just a video to work with. Then came the moment I'd chosen as the theater for his unraveling. Michael's company's annual awards night. It was an event of suits and speeches and a certain corporate smugness, the exact place where he loved to be seen and applauded. He'd been nominated for an award months earlier, before his other life started to leak into the world. He planned to attend, to step back into normalcy, to be crooned by colleagues who trusted the public image more than what a whistleblower might say. I knew he'd expect praise. I wanted him to have to face the truth in that same light. We could have staged a confrontation there, an ambush. But I'm not a fan of ambushes. I prefer to set the stage so the audience sees the full confession. With Emma's consent and the reporter's cooperation, we arranged for a short segment of the article to be presented in the awards program. The reporter agreed to attend and to be on hand if anyone from the press wanted comment. We contacted the company's board anonymously and asked for the HR meeting footage to be included in their internal review that night. The idea was simple. Have the company confront its champion with evidence in front of his peers. If they chose to stand by him, the public article and the mounting testimony would do the rest. If they chose to act, the action would be undeniable. Either way, the illusion of his untouchable status would end in that room.
The night of the awards, I sat in the back row like an old queen observing a small kingdom that was about to be dissolved. Leela stayed home. She didn't want to be a spectacle. Her decision made me proud. She'd reclaimed her agency in ways I had hoped for, and I wanted the pain to be hers no longer. I watched as Michael entered the room, hair slick, smile on, that practiced gait men like him use to claim a space. He waved at colleagues, drank champagne, and patted backs like a man paid to be admired. The irony of watching a man so revered be the subject of quiet ruin was a bitter-sweet relief. Halfway through the speeches, HR called Michael to the front under the pretense of a private presentation. He went, confused. The projector flickered to life and the lights dimmed. I felt my throat tighten when the footage rolled. The raw clip, the voicemail, Emma's recording playing like a blow-by-blow narration of intent. You could hear the collective intake of breath in the room as video after video stitched together a new portrait of him. Some faces in the crowd turned to horror, others to disbelief, some to anger. Michael sat in the front row, color leaving his face like paint being scraped away. He tried to stand, to protest, to call the projection a forgery. His lawyer stood phone in hand ready to interrupt. But this was no longer about spin. This was about the company owning what it had, and they could not unsee what was on the screen. For a terrifying second, I worried about the backlash. Men who circle their wounded might bite back. But the board, after a tense consultation, stood and announced he was being let go for cause. The word hit the room like a gavel. Some applauded quietly, others were stunned into silence. Michael was escorted out, not with the dignity he'd expected, but with the hollow thud of a man losing his podium. Outside, cameras waited like vultures, but the real victory was that his colleagues had watched truth unfold and chosen action. The humiliation was corporate, legal, and public, a triple bind that would be hard to survive. As he left, he glanced toward the back row where I sat. Our eyes met for one charged second. He looked broken and furious and terrified, a very small human inside a man he thought was invulnerable. I didn't gloat. I didn't laugh. I simply held his gaze and said nothing. Sometimes silence is the loudest sentence. The next morning, the town was a different place. People at the market looked at us differently, some with sympathy, some with a hard, relieved nod. Michael's social media accounts emptied as friends and colleagues unfollowed or deleted their tags. He called and left messages that I refused to listen to. Emma sat with me on the porch and we watched the sunlight move across the lawn. Two women who'd taken something ugly and refashioned it into a clear, cold truth. There was more to do. Court dates, depositions, the slow bureaucratic churn that turns pain into precedent. But in those hours after the awards, as the hum died down and the dust settled a little, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. Justice that was not vengeful, but necessary. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't painless. It changed people in the way truth always does.
Would you have let his sister risk everything like that? Would you have preferred a quieter resolution? Or is there something satisfying about seeing an abuser stripped of every platform he used to hurt people? Be honest, does the public collapse of a man like that feel like closure, or just spectacle? The months that followed felt like living in two worlds at once. The crushing, paper-strewn world of court dates and depositions, and the quieter, stranger world where a woman you love rebuilds herself in small, deliberate ways. We filed the formal charges. The DA moved with a slowness that was maddening and also oddly protective, careful, methodical. There were interviews where I repeated the same sentences until they felt like incantations. He struck her. We have the footage. There are witnesses. Each retelling carved the memory into an official record. Michael's lawyer tried everything: delay, intimidation, offers to resolve this privately that were dressed up like concern. We refused. Lila's health mattered more than his comfort. When you're protecting someone you've loved since they were born, you learn quickly what's negotiable and what's not.
Court was its own theater, only colder. We sat with our lawyers and watched as the defense tried to smudge the edges of truth, to make the footage seem ambiguous, to suggest she'd provoked him, to imply that the bruise on her cheek was evidence of some mutual calamity, rather than a quick, ugly strike. It was infuriating, but expected. The prosecution laid out the timeline. The recording, Emma's testimony, the raw footage, the HR suspension, the social media trail. For the first time since the slap, I saw how the small stones I'd collected, the texts, the voicemails, the quiet witness statements, became a road that led to accountability. The jury listened, and for the first time, I watched strangers weigh our pain and nod. That nod felt like the town's collective conscience standing up. Meanwhile, Lila began to change. Not overnight. These things never look like a headline. She started with little gestures that added up. A new yoga class, a line of poetry she'd write and tuck in her pocket, coffee with friends she'd neglected while trying to keep a marriage afloat. Therapy helped. The therapist gave her words for what had been nameless for so long. She learned about gaslighting, about boundary setting, about how love that squeezes the air out of love isn't love at all. She was angry sometimes, righteously so, and she was sad sometimes, and sometimes she'd look at me with this shy, astonished gratitude that made me feel both proud and hollow. Pride because she chose herself, but hollow because the thing that made me fierce had been the same thing that had been failing her for decades. Silence turned into action. Michael's life narrowed. Jobless, with reputation shredded and family ties frayed, he tried to rebuild in small, desperate ways. There were apologies that landed like flat coins. There were attempts at reconciliation that felt like tests rather than repentance. Emma had to move out for a while. The family house became an awkward museum of what had been said and not said. I didn't celebrate his hardship. I watched it with the sober understanding that accountability is not revenge dressed up. It's the cost of action. You can't demand people change. You can only make it impossible for them to stay the same without consequence. There were moments when the price we paid hit me like a physical thing. Friends who were ambivalent drifted. Some said we'd gone too far, that the scandal had been public and humiliating. Others tightened around us like a rope. It's strange how cruelty repels and draws people at once. For every voice that whispered too much, a dozen others said, quietly, "Thank you." You learn quickly which voices matter. I learned to let the rest fall away like dead leaves. At the end of the legal calendar, the judge issued a ruling that felt like a punctuation mark on a long, grinding sentence. Michael received a conviction for assault. It was not the end of the man, but it was the end of the story where his behavior went unchallenged. The sentence included mandatory counseling, community service, and a restraining order that made it clear the legal system would be watching him for a long while. Justice, in the measured way the system can deliver it, had been served. We cried in the hall afterward, not from triumph, but from a wearied relief that the paperwork had turned into a boundary that could be enforced.
People often ask if I felt satisfied. Satisfaction isn't a clean thing. There was a rush, sure, the kind you get when the last stitch of something dangerous is cut away. But there was also a fatigue and a complexity that surprised me. I'd wanted to spare my daughter a lifetime of small humiliations and daily diminishment. I'd wanted to make sure that men who thought their hands were a right learned they were not. In that sense, yes, it felt righteous. But I missed the family lunches that didn't have an asterisk beside them. I missed the illusion, however false, of normalcy. We had traded a brittle peace for a truthful, if scarred, freedom. Leela and I started doing normal things again, on purpose. We took a weekend trip to the coast, where the air smells of salt and the world seems bigger than the small cruelties of one person.
She laughed freely for the first time in months when a wave soaked her shoes, and she danced like a child who had been told secrets. I watched her and thought about all the daughters, all the people who stay silent because they fear the collapse of the world they know. My chest tightened with both grief and gratitude. Grief for what she'd lost, the illusion of safety with the man she loved, and gratitude that the person she loved most, herself, was showing up again. There were, of course, consequences for me that surprised me. I'd become a public figure of sorts. Neighbors who once nodded now offered thanks. Strangers sent messages telling stories of their own mothers who stood in similar shadows. Some of those messages were small offerings of solidarity. Others were confessions I couldn't ignore. I began, in a way I hadn't chosen, to be part of a conversation about how we respond to domestic abuse. People ask how I'd gathered evidence, how I'd persuaded witnesses, whether the public exposure was necessary. I answered honestly. I did what I believed would work. I didn't revel in ruin. I built a case because silence had already proven lethal. If someone took courage from that, I accepted it as a strange honor. We stayed close with Emma, whose betrayal of her family was actually the bravest act she had ever made. She and Leela rebuilt a sisterhood that didn't revolve around excuses. It took time and a good deal of awkwardness, but there was a gentle, resilient bond that formed from the shards. Michael's parents drifted away. Some family members never spoke to Emma again. The cost of truth is often loneliness, and we tried to hold one another through the absences. In the quiet evenings, when the house settles and the television murmurs without command, I find myself replaying that night. The sound of the slap, my strange smile, the slow click of my heels as I walked out. I wonder about the wound that made me so vigilant. I think about my own past, about choices made in kitchens and back rooms, about promises whispered over hospital beds. I think about the practicalities of anger and the ethics of exposure. Would you have done the same? Would you have waited, collected evidence, let the law and the community do their work? Or would you have stood in the light and confronted him in that moment with a fury that matched what you felt? Be honest. Would you have let him walk out humiliated and shamed? Or would you have struck back with your own hands? If I could give one piece of advice, it would be this. Protect the person, not the illusion. People will tell you to consider nuance, to think of consequences. They're not wrong. But nuance is not an excuse for silence. If someone you love is being made small, the first loyalty must be to their safety and their agency. The rest, the legalities, the narratives, the reputations, can be rebuilt. You can't rebuild a life that's been worn away from the inside. In the end, Leela remarried. Not because anyone pressured her, but because she wanted to. Because she met someone who asked questions and listened, who respected that her heart had been broken and did not presume it was his job to fix it. The wedding was small, simple, guarded in ways that mattered. I stood at her side, older in the ways that matter, and watched her choose joy with her eyes open. When she smiled at the altar, it wasn't naive, it was wise. She had new boundaries, new language, and a fierce kindness that had been honed like a tool. As for Michael, he lives in the periphery of our story now, a cautionary footnote. He does community service, attends court-ordered counseling, and sometimes I catch his name in passing conversation like a bad weather report. He's less colorful than he used to be, quieter, a man diminished by his choices. I don't relish his losses. I simply recognize them for what they are, the inevitable contracts of actions. When I tuck my granddaughter into bed, the little child of Leela's new life, a warm, breathing reminder of survival, I tell her stories of courage, not cruelty. I tell her how we stood together and how we chose truth. And sometimes, when the house is still and I can let my guard down, I allow myself a small, private satisfaction. That the hand that raised itself in anger will no longer have the power to shape my daughter's life. That for now is enough.